Ma. Oh, hello, hello. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Sorry, I had to go away a little bit there at the beginning. Inevitable, or unavoidable, rather. Same difference. Uh, Hello, Mr. Beast. Hello, Dr. DeAngles. How are y'all doing? Yeah. Okay. Don't ask me that. Okay. Time to. I'm doing well. Doing well, doing well, doing well. Want to get some more sense and sensibility in. Y'all need to make some sense, okay? I got my copy here. There's some ASMR drinking. Okay. Sunday night. Sunday night sense. It's Sense and Sensibility Sunday. Got some Jane Austen. Let's just jump right into it. Chapter 12. If you remember last time, excuse me. The what was their name? Dashwood sisters. The Dashwood family, their mother and the three sisters, were cheated. Not necessarily cheated, but were not given proper dues out of their portion of their father-in-law or grandfather's, yeah, grandfather or second grandfather, whatever, family, out of the will, and they were forced to move out of their childhood home out into Devonshire, I believe, where they have come across a couple of interesting characters. Oh, hey, kitty. A Colonel Brandon, very dour older gentleman. A Willoughby, a young, spry hunter who's very rich, or at least will be. Um, and I think it was John Middleton, the lord of the land, who's a very friendly man and loves to share in the company of others, throwing many parties and such. Kitty, you want to come up, Kitty? Oh, he doesn't want to come up on camera. He's camera shy. Or do you? Kitty, this is my kitty. His name is Evil. Uh, he's very evil. He's a little devil. I love how it says I have one viewer and yet two people are commenting simultaneously. Very funny. Oh, bye, kitty. He doesn't like to look that way. He doesn't like to look at the camera. He wants to look at me when I'm holding him because he just loves me so much. Chapter 12. As Eleanor and Marianne were walking together the next morning, the latter communicated a piece of news to her sister, which, in spite of all that she knew before of Marianne's imprudence and want of thought, surprised her by its extravagant testimony of both. Marianne told her, with the greatest delight, that Willoughby had given her a horse, one that he had bred himself on his estate in Somersetshire, and which was exactly calculated to carry a woman. Without considering that it was not in her mother's plan to keep any horse, that if she were to alter her resolution in favour of this gift, she must buy another for the servant, and keep a servant to ride it, and after all build a stable to receive them. She had accepted the present without hesitation, and told her sister of it in raptures. He intends to send his groom into Somersetshire immediately for it, she added, and when it arrives we will ride every day. You shall you shall share its use with me. Imagine yourself, my dear Eleanor, the delight of a gallop on some of these downs. Most unwilling was she to awaken from such a dream of facility to comprehend all the unhappy truths which attended the affair, and for some time she refused to submit to them. As to an additional servant, the expense would be a trifle. Mamma, she was sure, would never object to it, and any horse would do for him. He might always get one at the park. As to a stable, the merest shed would be sufficient. Eleanor then ventured to doubt the propriety of her receiving such a present from a man so little, or at least so lately known to her. This was too much. You are mistaken, Eleanor, she said warmly, in supposing I know very little of Willoughby. I have not known him long indeed, but I am much better acquainted with him than I am with any other creature in the world, except yourself and mamma. It is not time or opportunity that is to determine intimacy, it is disposition alone. 7 years would be insufficient to make some people acquainted with each other, and 7 days are more than enough for others. I should hold myself guilty of the greater impropriety in accepting a horse from my brother than from Willoughby. Of John I know very little, though we have lived together for years, but of Willoughby my judgment has long been formed. I don't know. I think you might be mixing things up there, Marianne. Uh, okay. Eleanor thought it wisest to touch that point no more. She knew her sister's temper. Opposition on so tender a subject would only attach her the more to her own opinion. But by an appeal to her affection from her mother, by representing the inconveniences which that indulgent mother must draw on herself if, as would be probably be the case, she consented to this increase of establishment, Marianne was shortly subdued, and she promised not to tempt her mother to such imprudent kindness by mentioning the offer, and to tell Willoughby, when she saw him next, that it must be declined. She was faithful to her word, and when Willoughby called at the cottage the same day, Eleanor heard her express her disappointment to him in a low voice, on being obliged to forego the acceptance of this present. The results for this alteration were at the same time related, and they were such as to make further entreaty on his side impossible. His concern, however, was very apparent, and after expressing it with earnestness, he added in the same low voice, Marianne, the horse is still yours, though you cannot use it now. I shall keep it only till you can claim it. You leave Barton to form your own establishment, a more lasting home. Queen Mab shall receive you. This was overheard by Miss Dashwood, and in the whole of the sentence, in his manner of pronouncing it, and in his addressing her sister by her Christian name alone, she instantly saw an intimacy so decided, a meaning so direct, as marked a perfect agreement between them. From that moment she doubted not of their being engaged to each other, and the belief of it created no other surprise than that she, or any of their friends, should be left by tempers so frank to discover it by accident. Margaret related something to her the next day which placed this matter in a still clearer light. Willoughby had spent the preceding evening with them, and Margaret, by being left some time in the parlour with only him and Mary Ann, had had opportunity for observations, which, with a most important face, she communicated to her elder sister. They were next by themselves. "Oh, Eleanor!" she cried, "I have such a secret to tell you about Mary Ann. I am sure she will be married to Mr. Willoughby very soon." "You have said so," replied Eleanor, "almost every day since they first met on High Church Down, and they had not known each other a week, I believe, before you were certain that Mary Ann wore his picture round her neck, but it turned out only to be the miniature of our great uncle." "But indeed this is quite another thing. I am sure they will be married very soon, for he has got a lock of her hair." "Take care, Margaret. It may be only the hair of some great uncle of his." "But indeed, Eleanor, it is Mary Ann's. I am almost sure of it. I am almost sure it is, for I saw him cut it off last night after tea, when you and mamma went out of the room. They were whispering and talking together as fast as could be. He seemed to be begging something of her, and presently he took up her scissors and cut off a long lock of her hair, for it was all tumbled down her neck. He kissed it, and folded it up in a piece of white paper, and put it in his pocket book." From such particulars stated on such authority, Eleanor could not withhold her credit, nor was she disposed to it, for the circumstance was in perfect unison with what she had heard and seen herself. Margaret's sagacity was not always displayed in a way so satisfactory to her sister. When Mrs. Jennings attacked her one evening at the park, to give the name of the young man who was Eleanor's particular favourite, which had been long a matter of great curiosity toward her, Margaret answered by looking at her sister and saying, "I must not tell, may I, Eleanor?" This of course made everybody laugh, and Eleanor tried to laugh too. The effort was painful. She was convinced that Margaret had fixed on a person whose name she could not bear with composure to become a standing joke with Mrs. Jennings. Mary Ann felt for her most sincerely, but she did more harm than good to the cause by turning very red and saying in an angry manner to Margaret, "Remember, whatever your conjectures may be, you have no right to repeat them." "I have never had any conjectures about it," replied Margaret. "It was you who told me of it yourself." This increased the mirth of the company, and Margaret was eagerly pressed to say some more. "Oh, pray, Miss Margaret, let us know all about it," said Mrs. Jennings. "What is the gentleman's name?" "I must not tell, ma'am, but I know very well what it is, and I know where he is, too." "Yes, yes, we can guess where he is, at his own house at Norland, to be sure. He is in the curate of the parish, I dare say." "Oh, that he is not. He is of no profession at all." "Margaret," said Marianne with great warmth, "you know that all this is an invention of your own, and that there is no such person in existence." "Well, then he is lately dead, Marianne, for I am sure there was such a man once, and his name begins with an F. Most gratefully did Eleanor feel to Lady Middleton for observing at this moment that it rained very hard, though she believed the interruption to proceed less from any attention to her than from her ladyship's great dislike of all such inelegant subjects of raillery as delighted her husband and mother. The idea, however, stated by her, was immediately pursued by Colonel Brandon, who was on every occasion mindful of the feelings of others, and much was said on the subject of rain by both of them. Willoughby opened the pianoforte and asked Marianne to sit down to it. Thus, and thus, amidst the various endeavours of different people to quit the topic, it fell to the ground, and not so easily did Eleanor recover from the alarm into which it had thrown her. A party was formed this evening for going on the following day to see a very fine place about 12 miles from Barton, belonging to a brother-in-law of Colonel Brandon, without whose interest it could not be seen, as the proprietor, who was then abroad, had left strict orders on that heed. The grounds were declared to be highly beautiful, and Sir John, who was particularly warm in their praise, might be allowed to be a tolerable judge, for he had formed parties to visit them at least twice every summer for the last 10 years. They contained a noble piece of water, a sail on which was to form a great part of the morning's amusement. Cold provisions were to be taken, open carriages only to be employed, and everything conducted in the usual style of a complete party of pleasure. To some few of the company it appeared rather a bold undertaking, considering the time of year, and that it had rained every day for the last fortnight, and Mrs. Dashwood, who had already a cold, was persuaded by Eleanor to stay at home. Chapter 13. Their intended excursion to Whitwell turned out very differently from what Eleanor had expected. She was prepared to be wet through, fatigued, and frightened, but the event was still more unfortunate, for they did not go at all. By 10 o'clock the whole party were assembled at the park, where they were to breakfast. The morning was rather favourable, though it had rained all night, as the clouds were then dispersing across the sky. The sun frequently appeared. They were all in high spirits and good humour, eager to be happy, and determined to submit to the greatest inconveniences and hardships, rather than to be otherwise. While they were at breakfast, the letters were brought in. Among the rest, there was one for Colonel Brandon. He took it, looked at the direction, changed colour, and immediately left the room. "What is the matter with Brandon?" said Sir John. Nobody could tell. "I hope he has had no bad news," said Lady Middleton. "It must be something extraordinary that could make Colonel Brandon leave my breakfast table so suddenly." In about 5 minutes he returned. "No bad news, Colonel, I hope," said Mrs. Jennings as soon as he entered the room. "None at all, ma'am, I thank you." "Was it from Avignon? I hope it is not to say that your sister is worse." "No, ma'am. Came from town, and is merely a letter of business." "But how came the hand to discompose you so much if it was only a letter of business? Come, come, this won't do, Colonel, so let us hear the truth of it." "My dear ma'am," said Lady Middleton, "recollect what you are saying." "Perhaps it is to tell you that your cousin Fanny is married," said Mrs. Jennings, without attending to her daughter's reproof. "No, indeed, it is not." "Well, then, I know who it is from, Colonel. I hope she is well." "Whom do you mean, ma'am?" said he, colouring a little. "Oh, you know who I mean." I am particularly sorry, ma'am, said he, addressing Lady Middleton, that I should receive this letter today, for it is on business which requires my immediate attendance in town. In town! cries Mrs. Jennings. What can you have to do in town at this time of year? My own loss is great, he continued, in being obliged to leave so agreeable a party. But I am the more concerned, as I fear my presence is necessary to gain your admittance at Whitwell. What a blow upon them all was this! But if you write a note to the housekeeper, Mr. Brandon, said Mary Ann eagerly, will it not be sufficient? He shook his head. We must go, said Sir John. It shall not be put off, when we are so near it. You cannot go to town till tomorrow, Brandon, that is all. I wish it could be settled, so easily settled, but it is not in my power to delay my journey for one day. If you would but let us know what your business is, said Miss Jennings, we might see whether it could be put off or not. You would not be 6 hours later, said Willoughby, if you were to defer your journey till our return. I cannot afford to lose 1 hour. Eleanor then heard Willoughby say in a low voice to Marianne, there are some people who cannot bear a party of pleasure. Brandon is one of them. He was afraid of catching cold, I dare say, and invented this trick for getting out of it. I would lay 50 guineas the letter was of his own writing. I have no doubt of it, replied Marianne. There's no persuading you to change your mind, Brandon. I know of old, said Sir John, when once you are determined of anything. But, however, I hope you will think better of it. Consider, here are the two Miss Careys coming over from Newton. The three Miss Dashwoods walked up from the cottage, and Mr. Willoughby got up 2 hours before his usual time, on purpose to go to Whitwell. Colonel Brandon again repeated his sorrow at being the cause of disappointing the party, but at the same time declared it to be unavoidable. Well, then, when will you come back again? I hope we shall see you at Barton, adding her ladyship, as soon as you can conveniently leave town. We must put off the party to Whitwell till your return. You are very obliging, but it is so uncertain when I may have it in my power to return that I dare not engage for it at all. Oh, he must and shall come back, cried Sir John. If he is not here by the end of the week, I shall go after him. I do so, Sir John, cried Mrs. Jennings, and then perhaps you may find out what his business is. I do not want to pry into other men's concerns. I suppose it is something he is ashamed of. Colonel Brandon's horses were announced. You do not go to town on horseback, do you? Added Sir John. No, only to Honiton. I shall then go post. Well, as you are resolved to go, I wish you a good journey, but you had better change your mind. I assure you it is not in my power. He then took leave of the whole party. Is there no chance of my seeing you and your sisters in town this winter, Miss Dashwood? I am afraid none at all. Then I must bid you farewell for a longer time than I should wish to do. Marianne, he merely bowed and said nothing. Come, Colonel, said Mrs. Jennings, before you go, do let us know what you are going about. He wished her a good morning, and attended by Sir John left the room. Oh, secrets! The complaints and lamentations which politeness had hitherto restrained now burst forth universally, and they all agreed again and again how provoking it was to be so disappointed. I can guess what his business is, however, said Mrs. Jennings exultingly. Can you, ma'am? Said almost everybody. Yes, it is about Miss Williams, I am sure. And who is Miss Williams? Asked Marianne. What? Do you not know who Miss Williams is? I am sure you must have heard of her before. She is a relation of the Colonel's, my dear, a very near relation. We will not say how near, for fear of shocking the young ladies. Then, lowering her voice a little, she said to Eleanor, "She is his natural daughter." "Indeed!" You know, he was unlucky in love, but he has a daughter. Oh, yes, and as like him as she can stare. I dare say the colonel will leave her all his fortune." When Sir John returned, he joined most heartily in the general regret in so unfortunate an event, concluding, however, by observing that as they were all together, they must do something by way of being happy, and after some consultation it was agreed that although happiness could only be enjoyed at Whitwell, they might procure a tolerable composure of mind by driving about the country. The carriages were then ordered. Willoughby's was first, and Marianne never looked happier than when she got into it. He drove through the park very fast, and they were soon out of sight, and nothing more of them was seen till their return, which did not happen till after the return of all the rest. They both seemed delighted with their drive, but said only in general terms that they had kept in the lanes while the others went on the downs. It was settled that there should be a dance in the evening, and that everybody should be extremely merry all day long. Some more of the Careys came to dinner, and they had the pleasure of sitting down nearly 20 to table, which Sir John observed with great contentment. Willoughby took his usual place between the two elder Miss Dashwoods. Mrs. Jennings sat on Eleanor's right hand, and they had not been long seated before she leaned behind her and Willoughby and said to Marianne loud enough for them both to hear, "I have found you out in spite of your tricks. I know where you spent the morning." Marianne colored and replied very hastily, "Where, pray?" "Did not you know," said Willoughby, "that we had been out in my curricle?" "Yes, yes, Mr. Impudence." "Yes, yes, Mr. Impudence." I'm gonna start calling you Mr. Impudence. You know who I'm talking to. "I know that very well, and I was determined to find out where you had been to. I hope you like your house, Miss Marianne. It is a very large one, I know, and when I come to see you, I hope you will have new furnished it, for it wanted it very much when I was there 6 years ago." Marianne turned away in great confusion. Mrs. Jennings laughed heartily, and Eleanor found that in her resolution to know where they had been, she had actually made her own woman inquire of Mr. Willoughby's groom, that she had by that method been informed that they had gone to Allenham, spent a considerable time there in walking about the garden and going all over the house. Eleanor could hardly believe this to be true, as it seemed very unlikely that Willoughby should propose to or Marianne consent to enter the house while Mrs. Smith was in it, with whom Marianne had not the smallest acquaintance. As soon as they left the dining room, Eleanor inquired of her about it, and great was her surprise when she found out that every circumstance related by Mrs. Jennings was perfectly true. Marianne was quite angry with her for doubting it. "Why should you imagine, Eleanor, that we did not go there, or that we did not see the house? Is it not what you have often wished to do yourself?" "Yes, Marianne, but I would not go while Mrs. Smith was there, and with no other companion than Mr. Willoughby. Mr. Willoughby, however, is the only person who can have a right to show that house, and as we went in an open carriage, it was impossible to have any other companion. I never spent a pleasanter morning in my life." "I am afraid," replied Eleanor, "that the pleasantness of an employment does not always invice its propriety." That's true. On the contrary, nothing can be stronger proof of it, Eleanor, for if there had been any real impropriety in what I did, I should have been sensible of it at the time, for we always know when we are acting wrong, and with such a conviction I could have had no pleasure. I think it's true we always know when we're acting wrong, but that might but I can't know it. I can't know if it's true for you, but generally I feel like I know if I really sat down and was like, yeah, sometimes it's easy to not think about it, but you know in the back of your head, yeah, I'm acting wrong. But my dear Marianne, as it has already exposed you to some very pertinent remarks, do you not now begin to doubt the discretion of your own conduct? If the impertinent remarks of Mrs. Jennings are to be the proof of impropriety in conduct, we are all offending every moment of our lives. I value not her censure any more than I should do her commendation. I am not sensible of having done anything wrong in walking over Mrs. Smith's grounds, or in seeing her house. They will one day be Mr. Willoughby's, and if they were one day to be your own, Marianne, you would not be justified in what you have done. Jeez Louise. Eleanor, come on, man. You're a real stick in the mud here. She blushed at this hint, but it was even visibly gratifying to her, and after a 10 minutes' interval of earnest thought, she came to her sister again and said with great good humour, "Perhaps, Eleanor, it was rather ill judged in me to go to Allenham, but Mr. Willoughby wanted particularly to show me the place, and it is a charming house, I assure you. There was one remarkably pretty sitting room upstairs, of a nice comfortable size for constant use, and with modern furniture it would be delightful. It is a corner room and has windows on two sides. On one side you look across the bowling green behind the house to a beautiful hanging wood, and on the other you have a view of the church and village, and beyond them of those fine bold hills that we have so often admired. I did not see it to advantage, for nothing could be more forlorn than the furniture. But if it were newly fitted up, a couple of £100, Willoughby says, would make it one of the pleasanter summer rooms in England. Could Eleanor have listened to her without interruption from the others, she would have described every room in the house with equal delight. Ooh, me oh my. Helen was a real stick in the mud, man. She's what you have done visiting this house. I know she's trying to say, yeah, you guys might have had a bit of that you guys might have been doing the dirty, a bit of that recreational procreation. But I'm sure Marianne would do no such thing. Come now, how dare you suggest such a thing of your own sister? Chapter 14. The sudden termination of Colonel Brandon's visit at the park, with his steadiness in concealing its cause, filled the mind and raised the wonder of Mrs. Jennings for 2 or 3 days. She was a great wanderer, as everyone must be who takes a very lively interest in all the comings and goings of all their acquaintance. She wondered with little intermission what could be the reason of it, was sure there must be some bad news, and thought over every kind of distress that could have befallen him, with a fixed determination that he should not escape them all. Something very melancholy must be the matter, I am sure, said she. I could see it in his face, poor man. I am afraid his circumstances may be bad. The estate at Delaford was never reckoned more than 2,000 a year, and his brother left everything sadly involved. I do think he must have been sent for about money matters, for what else can it be? I wonder whether it is so. I would give anything to know the truth of it. Perhaps it is about Miss Williams, and, by the by, I dare say it is, because he looked so conscious when I mentioned her. Maybe she is ill in town. Nothing in the world more likely, for I have the notion that she is always rather sickly. I would lay any wager it is about Miss Williams. It is not so very likely he should be distressed in his circumstances now, for he is a very prudent man, and, to be sure, must have cleared the estate by this time. I wonder what it can be. Maybe his sister is worse at Avongon, and has sent for him over. His setting off in such a hurry seems very like it. Well, I wish him out of all his trouble with all my heart, and a good wife into the bargain. So wondered, so talked Miss Jennings, her opinion varying with every fresh conjecture. It all seemed equally probable as they arose. Eleanor, though she felt really interested in the welfare of Colonel Brandon, could not bestow all the wonder on his going so suddenly away which Mrs. Jennings was desirous of her feeling. For, besides, all the circumstance did not, in her opinion, justify such lasting amazement or variety of speculation. Her wonder was otherwise disposed of. It was engrossed by the extraordinary silence of her sister and Willoughby on the subject, which they must know to be particularly interesting to them all. As this silence continued, every day made it appear more strange and more incompatible with the disposition of both. Why they should not openly acknowledge to her mother and herself what their constant behavior to each other declared to have taken place, Eleanor could not imagine. She could easily conceive that marriage might not be immediately in their power, for though Willoughby was independent, there was no reason to believe him rich. His estate had been rated by Sir John at about 600 or 700 a year, but he lived on an expense to which that income could hardly be equal, and he had himself often complained of his poverty, but for this strange kind of secrecy maintained by them relative to their engagement, which in fact concealed nothing at all. She could not account, for it was so wholly contradictory to their general opinions and practice, that a doubt sometimes entered her mind of their being really engaged, and this doubt was enough to prevent her making any inquiry of Marianne. Nothing could be more expressive of attachment to them all than Willoughby's behavior. To Marianne it had all the distinguishing tenderness which a lover's heart could give. Excuse me. Burpee. Burpee. And to the rest of the family it was the affectionate attention of a son and a brother. The cottage seemed to be oh my. Oh wow. She got understood what that meant. She got they're worried that she's friend zoned or family zoned really. Nothing could be more expressive of attachment to them all than Willoughby's behavior. To Marianne it had all the distinguishing tenderness of a lover's heart could give, which a lover's heart could give, and to the rest of the family it was the affectionate attention of a son and a brother. Attachment to them all. Oh, okay. So he, yes, he does. He treats her like a lover. He didn't family zone her. He just treats everybody else like they're already family. I understand. The cottage seemed to be considered and loved by him as his home. Many more of his hours were spent there than at Allenham, and if no general engagement collected them at the park, exercise which called him out in the morning was almost certain of ending there. When the rest of the day was spent by himself at the side of Marianne, by his favorite by his favorite pointer at her feet. One evening in particular, about a week after Colonel Brandon had left the country, his heart seemed more than usually open to every feeling of attachment to the objects around him, and on Mrs. Dashwood's happening to mention her design of improving the cottage in spring, he warmly opposed every alteration of a place which affection had established as perfect with him. "What!" he exclaimed, "improve this dear cottage? No, that I will never consent to. Not a stone must be added to its walls, not an inch of its size, if my feelings are regarded." "Not be alarmed," said Miss Dashwood. "Nothing of the kind will be done, for my mother will never have money enough to attempt it." "I am heartily glad of it, heartily glad of it," he said. "May she always be poor if she can employ her riches no better." "Thank you, Willoughby, but you may be assured that I will not sacrifice one sentiment of local attachment of yours, or of any one whom I loved, for all the improvements in the world. Depend upon it that whatever unemployed sum may remain when I make up my accounts in the spring, I would even rather lay it uselessly than dispose of it in a manner so painful to you. But are you really so attached to this place as to see no defect in it?" "I am," said he. "To me it is faultless. Nay, more, I consider it the only form of building in which happiness is attainable, and were I rich enough I would instantly pull Combay down and build it up again in the exact plan of this cottage." "With dark, narrow stairs, and a kitchen that smokes, I suppose," said Eleanor. "Yes," cried he in the same eager tone, "with all and everything belonging to it. In no one convenience or inconvenience about it should the least variation be perceptible. Then, and then only, under such a roof, I might perhaps be as happy at Combe as I have been at Barton." "I flatter myself," replied Eleanor, "that even under the disadvantage of better rooms and a broader staircase, you will hereafter find your own house as faultless as you now do this." "There certainly are circumstances," said Willoughby, "which might greatly endear it to me, but this place will always have one claim on my affection which no other can possibly share." Mrs. Dashwood looked with pleasure at Marianne, whose fine eyes were fixed so expressively on Willoughby as plainly denoted how well she understood him. "How often did I wish," added he, "when I was at Allenham this time 12 month, that Barton Cottage were inhabited. I never passed within view of it without admiring its situation and grieving that no one should live in it. How little did I then think that the very first news I should hear from Mrs. Smith then, when I came into the country, would be that Barton Cottage was taken. I felt an immediate satisfaction and interest in the event, but nothing but a kind of presence of what happiness I should experience from it can account. Oof, man, I'm losing it here. Let me try that again. That's a long sentence. How little did I think then that, wow, how little did I then think that the very first news I should hear from Mrs. Smith when I came into the country would be that Barton Cottage was taken, I felt an immediate satisfaction and interest in the event, which nothing but a kind of prescience prescience of what happiness I should experience from it can account for. Must it not have been so, Marianne? Speaking to her in a lowered voice, then continuing his former tone, he said, "And yet this house you would spoil, Mrs. Dashwood? You would rob it of its simplicity by imaginary improvement? And this dear parlour in which our acquaintance first began, and in which so many happy hours have been since spent by us together, you would degrade to the condition of a common entrance, and everybody would be eager to pass through the room which has hitherto contained within itself more real accommodation and comfort than any other apartment of the handsomest dimensions in the world could possibly afford." Mrs. Dashwood again assured him that no alteration of the kind would be attempted. "You are a good woman," he warmly replied. "Your promise makes me easy. Extend it a little farther, and it will make me happy. Tell me that not only your house will remain the same, but that I shall ever find you and yours as unchanged as your dwelling, and that you will always consider me with the kindness which has made everything belonging to you so dear to me." The promise was readily given, and Willoughby's behaviour during the whole of the evening declared at once his affection and happiness. "Shall we see you tomorrow at dinner?" said Mrs. Dashwood when he was leaving them. "I do not ask you to come in the morning, for we must walk to the park to call on Lady Middleton." He engaged to be with them at 4 o'clock. Ooh, man, I'm starting to get tired already. Long day. Long day. I'll get a few more chapters in, though. I'm not going to call it quite yet. Only been reading for like 15 pages. Not that it's a rush to get through it, like I've said. And I do have to work in the morning, so can't go for too long tonight. Chapter 15. Mrs. Dashwood's visit to Lady Middleton took place the next day, and two of her daughters went with her, but Marianne excused herself from being of the party under some trifling pretext of employment, and her mother, who concluded that a promise had been made by Willoughby the night before of calling on her while they were absent, was perfectly satisfied with her remaining at home. On their return from the park they found Willoughby's curricle and servant in waiting at the cottage, and Mrs. Dashwood was convinced that her conjecture had been just. So far it was all she had foreseen, but on entering the house she beheld that no foresight had taught her to expect. They were no sooner in the passage than Marianne came hastily out of the parlour, apparently in violent affection, with her handkerchief at her eyes, and without noticing them ran upstairs. Surprised and alarmed, they proceeded directly into the room she had just quitted, found, where they found only Willoughby, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his back towards them. He turned round on their coming in, and his countenance showed that he strongly partook of the emotion which overpowered Marianne. "Is anything the matter with her?" cried Mrs. Dashwood as she entered. "Is she ill?" "I hope not," he replied, trying to look cheerful, and with a forced smile presently added, "It is I who may rather expect to be ill, for I am now suffering under a very heavy disappointment." "Disappointment?" "Yes, for I am unable to keep my engagement with you. Mrs. Smith has this morning exercised the privilege of riches upon a poor dependent cousin by sending me on business to London." I have just received my dispatches and taken my farewell of Allenham, and by way of acceleration, I am now come to take my farewell of you. To London? Are you going this morning? Almost this moment. This is very unfortunate, but Mrs. Smith must be obliged, and her business will not detain you from us long, I hope. He colored as he replied, "You are very kind, but I have no idea of returning into Devonshire immediately. My visits to Mrs. Smith are never repeated within the 12 month. And is Mrs. Smith your only friend? Is Allenham the only house in the neighborhood to which you will be welcome? For shame, Willoughby! Can you wait for an invitation here?" His color increased. With his eyes fixed on the ground, he only replied, "You are too good." Mrs. Dashwood looked at Eleanor with surprise. Eleanor felt equal amazement. For a few moments everybody was silent. Mrs. Dashwood first spoke. "I have only to add, my dear Willoughby, that at Barton Cottage you will always be welcome. For I will not press you to return here immediately, because you only can judge how far that might be pleasing to Mrs. Smith, and on this heed I shall be no more disposed to question your judgment than to doubt your inclination." "My engagements at present," replied Willoughby confusedly, "are of such a nature that I dare not flatter myself—" He stopped. Mrs. Dashwood was too much astonished to speak, and another pause succeeded. This was broken by Willoughby, who said with a faint smile, "It is folly to linger in this manner. I will not torment myself any longer by remaining among friends whose society it is impossible for me now to enjoy." He then hastily took leave of them all, and left the room. They saw him step into his carriage, and in a minute it was out of sight. Mrs. Dashwood felt too much for speech, and instantly quitted the parlour, to give way in solitude and concern and alarm which this sudden departure occasioned. Eleanor's uneasiness was at least equal to her mother's. She thought of what had just passed with anxiety and distrust. Willoughby's behaviour in taking leave of them, his embarrassment and affectation of cheerfulness, and, above all, his unwillingness to accept her mother's invitation, a backwardness so unlike a lover, so unlike himself, greatly disturbed her. One moment she feared that no serious design had ever been formed on his side, and the next that some unfortunate quarrel had taken place between him and her sister. The distress in which Marianne had quitted the room was such as a serious quarrel could most reasonably account for, though when she considered that what Marianne's love for him was, a quarrel seemed almost impossible. But whatever might be the particulars of their separation, her sister's affliction was indubitable, for she thought with the tenderness compassion of that violent sorrow which Marianne was in all probability not merely giving way to as relief, but feeding and encouraging as a duty. In about half an hour her mother returned, and though her eyes were red, her countenance was not cheerful. "Our dear Willoughby is now some miles from Barton, Eleanor, and she does as she said as she sat down to work. And with how heavy a heart does he travel! It is all very strange, so suddenly to be gone. It seems but the work of a moment. Last night he was with us so happy, so cheerful, so affectionate, and now, after only 10 minutes' notice, gone too without intending to return. Something more than what he owed something more than what he owed to us must have happened. He did not speak. He did not behave like himself. You must have seen the difference as well as I. What can it be? Can they have quarrelled? Why else should he have shown such unwillingness to accept your invitation here?" It was not inclination that he wanted, Eleanor. I could plainly see that. He had not the power of accepting it. I thought it over. I thought it all over, I assure you, and I can perfectly account for everything that at first seemed strange to me as well as to you. Can you indeed? Yes. I have explained it to myself in the most satisfactory way, but you, Eleanor, who love to doubt where you can, it will not satisfy you. I know, but you shall not talk me out of it, my trust in it. I am persuaded that Mrs. Smith suspects his regard for Marianne, disapproves of it, perhaps because she has other views for him, and on that account is eager to get him away, and that the business which she sends him off to transact is invented as an excuse to dismiss him. This is what I believe to have happened. He is moreover aware that she does disapprove of the connection. He dares not therefore at present confess to her his engagement with Marianne, and he feels himself obliged from his dependent situation to give in to her schemes and absent himself from Devonshire for a while. You will tell me, I know, that this may or may not have happened, but I will listen to no cavil unless you can point out any other method of understanding the affair as satisfactory as this. And now, Eleanor, what have you to say? Nothing, for you have anticipated my answer. Then you would have told me that it might or might not have happened. Oh, Eleanor, how incomprehensible you and your feelings. You had rather take evil upon credit than good. You had rather look out for misery for Marianne and guilt for poor Willoughby than apology for the latter. You are resolved to think him blamable because he took leave of us with less affection than his usual behaviour has shown, and is no allowance to be made for inadvertence or for spirits depressed by recent disappointment. Are no probabilities to be accepted merely because they are not certainties? Is nothing due to the man whom we have all so much reason to love and no reason in the world to think ill of? The possibility of motives unanswerable in themselves, though unavoidably secret for a while. And after all, what is it you suspect of him? I can hardly tell you myself, but suspicion of something unpleasant is the inevitable consequence of such an alteration as we have just witnessed in him. There is great truth, however, in what you have now urged of the allowance which ought to be made for him, and it is my wish to be candid in my judgment of everybody. Willoughby may undoubtedly have very sufficient reasons for his conduct, and I will hope that he has. But it would not have been more like Willoughby, would it not have been more like Willoughby to acknowledge them at once? Secrecy may be advisable, but still I cannot help wondering at its being practiced by him. Do not blame him, however, for departing from his character where the deviation is necessary. But you really do admit the justice of what I have just said in his defence? I am happy, and he is acquitted. Not entirely. It may be proper to conceal their engagement, they are engaged, from Mrs. Smith, and if that is the case, it must be highly expedient for Willoughby be but little in Devonshire at present. But this is no excuse for their concealing it from us. Concealing it from us, my dear child! Do you accuse Willoughby and Marianne of concealment? This is strange indeed, when your eyes have been reproaching them every day for incautiousness. I want no proof of their affection, said Eleanor, but of their engagement I do. I am perfectly satisfied of both. Yet not a syllable has been said to you on the subject by either of them. I have not wanted syllables where actions have spoken so plainly. Has not his behaviour to Mary Ann and to all of us for at least the last fortnight declared that he loved and considered her as his future wife, and that he felt for us the attachment of the nearest relation? Have we not perfectly understood each other? Has not my consent been daily asked by his looks, his manner, his attentive and affectionate respect? My Eleanor, is it possible to doubt their engagement? How could such a thought occur to you? How is it to be supposed that Willoughby, persuaded as he must be of your sister's love, should leave her, and leave her perhaps for months, without telling her of his affection, that they should part without a mutual exchange of confidence? I confess, replied Eleanor, that every circumstance except one is in favour of their engagement, but that one is the total silence but that one is the total silence of both on the subject, and with me it almost outweighs every other. How strange this is! You must think wretchedly indeed of Willoughby, if after all that has openly passed between them you can doubt the nature of the terms on which they are together. Has he been acting a part in his behaviour to your sister all this time? Do you suppose him really indifferent to her? No, I cannot think that. He must and does love her, I am sure. But with a strange kind of tenderness, if he can leave her with such an indifference, such carelessness of the future as you attribute to him. You must remember, my dear mother, that I have never considered this matter as certain. I have had my doubts, I confess. They are fainter than they were, and they may soon be entirely done away. If we find they correspond, every fear of mine will be removed. A mighty concession indeed. If you were to see them at the altar, you would suppose they were going to be married. Ungracious girl, but I require no such proof. Nothing, in my opinion, has ever passed to justify doubt. No secrecy has been attempted. All has been uniformly open and unreserved. You cannot doubt your sister's wishes. It must be Willoughby, therefore, whom you suspect. Why? Is he not a man of honour and feeling? Has there been any inconsistency on his side to create alarm? Can he be deceitful? I hope not. I believe not, cried Eleanor. I love Willoughby, sincerely love him, and suspicion of his integrity cannot be more painful to yourself than to me. It has been involuntary, and I will not encourage it. I was startled, I confess, by the alteration in his manners this morning. He did not speak like himself, and did not return your kindness with any cordiality. But all this may be explained by such a situation of his affairs as you have supposed. He had just departed from my sister, had seen her leave him in the greatest affliction, and, if he felt obliged, from a fear of offending Mrs. Smith, to resist the temptation of returning here soon, and yet aware of that by declining your invitation, by saying that he was going away for some time, he should seem to act un and ungenerous, a suspicious part by our family. He might well be embarrassed and disturbed. In such a case, a plain and open avowal of his difficulties would have been more to his honour, I think, as well as more consistent with his general character. But I will not raise objections against anyone's conduct on so illiberal a foundation as a difference in judgment from myself, or a deviation from which I may think right and consistent. You speak very properly. Willoughby certainly does not deserve to be suspected. Though we have not known him long, he is no stranger in this part of the world, and who has ever spoken to his disadvantage? Had he been in a situation to act independently and marry immediately, it might have been odd that he should leave us without acknowledging everything to me at once, but this is not the case. It is an engagement in some respects not prosperously begun. Their marriage must be at a very uncertain distance, and even secrecy, as far as it can be observed, may now be very advisable. They were interrupted by the entrance of Margaret. Eleanor was then at liberty to think over representations of her mother, to acknowledge the probability of many, and hope for the justice of all. They saw nothing of Marianne till dinner time, when she entered the room and took her place at the table without saying a word. Her eyes were red and swollen, and it seemed as if her tears were even then restrained with difficulty. She avoided the looks of them all, could neither eat nor speak, and after some time, on her mother's silently pressing her hand with tender compassion, her small degree of fortitude was quite overcome. She burst into tears and left the room. The violent depression of spirits continued the whole evening. She was without any power, because she was without any desire of command over herself. The slightest mention of anything relative to Willoughby overpowered her in an instant, and though her family were most anxiously attentive to her comfort, it was impossible for them, if they spoke at all, to keep clear of every subject which her feelings connected with him. Oh, Willoughby, what are you up to? You rapscallion, you. Hmm. I think I got time for one more chapter here. Just one more chapter for tonight. That chapter being chapter 16. Chapter 16. Marianne would have thought herself very inexcusable had she been able to sleep at all the first night after parting from Willoughby. She would have been ashamed to look her family in the face the next morning, had she not risen from her bed in more need of repose than when she lay down in it. But the feelings which made such composure a disgrace left her in no danger of incurring it. She was awake the whole night, and she wept the greatest part of it. She got up with a headache, was unable to talk, and unwilling to take any nourishment, giving pain every moment to her mother and sisters, and forbidding all attempts at consolation from either. Her sensibility was potent enough. When breakfast was over, she walked out by herself and wandered about the village of Allenham, indulging the recollection of past enjoyment, and crying over the present reverse for the chief of the morning. The evening passed off in the equal indulgence of feeling. She played over every favourite song that she had been used to play to Willoughby, every air which their voices had been oftenest joined, and sat at the instrument gazing on every line of music that he had written out for her, till her heart was so heavy that no further sadness could be gained. This nourishment of grief was every day applied. She spent whole hours at the pianoforte, alternately singing and crying, her voice often totally suspended by her tears. In books, too, as well as in music, she courted the misery which a contrast between the past and present was certain of giving. She read nothing but what they had been used to read together. Don't do this. Such violence of affliction indeed could not be supported forever. It sunk within a few days into a calmer melancholy, but these employments to which she daily recurred, her solitary walks and silent meditations, still produced occasional effusions of sorrow as lively as ever. No letter from Willoughby came, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Eleanor again became uneasy. Uh oh. Something really is up. but Mrs. Dashwood could find explanations whenever she wanted them, and at least satisfied herself. "Remember, Eleanor," said she, "how very often Sir John fetches our letters himself from the post and carries them to it. We have already agreed that secrecy may be necessary, and we must acknowledge that it could not be maintained if their correspondence were to pass through Sir John's hands." Eleanor could not deny the truth of this, and she tried to find in it a motive sufficient for their silence. But there was one method so direct, so simple, and in her opinion so elegant or so eligible of knowing the real state of the affair, and of instantly removing all mystery, that she could not help suggesting it to her mother. "Why do you not ask Marianne at once," said she, "whether she is or is not engaged to Willoughby? For you, her mother, and so kind, so indulgent a mother, the question could not give offence. It would be the natural result of your affection for her. She used to be all unreserve, and to you most especially." "I would not ask such a question for the world. Supposing it possible that they are not engaged, what distress would not such an inquiry inflict? At any rate, it would be most ungenerous. I should never desire her confidence again after forcing from her a confession of what is meant at present to be unacknowledged to any one. I know Marianne's heart. I know that she dearly loves me, and that I shall not be the last to whom the affair is made known, when circumstances make the revealment of it eligible. I would not attempt to force the confidence of any one, a child much less, because a sense of duty would prevent the denial which her wishes might direct." Eleanor thought this generosity overstrained, considering her sister's youth, and urged the matter further, but in vain. Common sense, common care, common prudence were all sunk in Mrs. Dashwood's romantic delicacy. It was several days before Willoughby's name was mentioned before Marianne by any of her family. Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, indeed, were not so nice. Their witticisms added pain to many a painful hour. But one evening Mrs. Dashwood, accidentally taking up a volume of Shakespeare, exclaimed, "We have never finished Hamlet, Marianne. Our dear Willoughby went away before we could get through it. We will put it by, and when he comes again, but it may be months, perhaps, before that happens." "Months!" cried Marianne with strong surprise. "No, nor many weeks." Mrs. Dashwood was sorry for what she had said, but it gave Eleanor pleasure, as it produced a reply from Marianne so expressive of confidence in Willoughby and knowledge of his intentions. Man, I wish the family just got together and just did all. Everybody just did Hamlet. They all just took apart and just did Hamlet. That'd be fun. One morning, about a week after his leaving the country, Marianne was prevailed on to join her sisters in their usual walk, instead of wandering away by herself. Hitherto she had carefully avoided every companion in her rambles. Her sisters intended to walk on the downs. She directly stole away towards the lanes. If they talked of the valley, she was as speedy in climbing the hills, and could never be found when the others set off. But at length she was secured by the exertions of Eleanor, who greatly disapproved such continual seclusion. They walked along the road through the valley, and chiefly in silence, for Marianne's mind could not be controlled, and Eleanor, satisfied with gaining one point, would not attempt more. Beyond the entrance of the valley, where the country, though still rich, was less wild and more open, a long stretch of the road they had travelled on first coming to Barton lay before them. On reaching that point, they stopped to look around them and examine a prospect which formed the distance of their view from the cottage. from a spot which they had never happened to reach in any of their walks before. Amongst the objects in the scene, they soon discovered an animated one. It was a man on horseback riding towards them. In a few moments they could distinguish him to be a gentleman, and in a moment afterwards Marianne rapturously exclaimed, "It is he! It is indeed! I know it is!" and was hastening to meet him, when Eleanor cried out, "Indeed, Marianne, I think you are mistaken. It is not Willoughby. The person is not tall enough for him, and has not his air." He has!" cried Marianne. "I'm sure he has. His air, his coat, his horse. I knew how soon he would come." She walked eagerly on as she spoke, and Eleanor screened Marianne from particularity, particular, particularity, as she felt almost certain of it not being Willoughby, quickened her pace and kept up with her. They were soon within 30 yards of the gentleman. Marianne looked again. Her heart sunk within her, and abruptly turned around. She was hurrying back when the voices of both her sisters were raised to detain her. A third, almost as well known as Willoughby's, joined them in begging her to stop, and she turned round with surprise to see and welcome Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could at that moment be forgiven for not being Willoughby, the only one who could have gained a smile from her, but she dispersed her tears to smile on him, and in her sister's happiness forgot for a time her own disappointment. He dismounted, giving his horse to his servant, walked back with them to Barton, whither he was purposely coming to visit them. He was welcomed by them all with great cordiality, but especially by Marianne, who showed more warmth of regard in her reception of him than even Eleanor herself. Marianne, indeed, the meeting between Edward and her sister was but a continuation of that unaccountable coldness which she had often observed at Norland in their mutual behaviour. On Edward's side, more particularly, there was a deficiency of all that a lover ought to look and say on such an occasion. He was confused, seemed scarcely sensible of pleasure in seeing them, looked either neither rapturous nor gay, said little but what was forced from him by questions, and distinguished Eleanor by no mark of affection. Marianne saw and listened with increasing surprise. She began almost to feel a dislike of Edward, and it ended, as every feeling must end with her, by carrying back her thoughts to Willoughby, whose manners formed a contrast sufficiently striking to those of his brother elect. After a short silence, which succeeded the first surprise and inquiries of meeting, Marianne asked Edward if he came directly from London. No, he had been in Devonshire a fortnight. A fortnight! She repeated, surprised at his being so long in the same country with Eleanor, and without seeing her before. He looked rather distressed, and he added he had been and he added that he had been staying with some friends near Plymouth. "Have you been lately in Sussex?" said Eleanor. "I was at Norland a month ago." "And how does dear, dear Norland look?" cried Marianne. "Dear, dear Norland," said Eleanor, "probably looks much as it always does at this time of year, the woods and walks thickly covered with dead leaves." "Oh," cried Marianne, "with what transporting sensations have I formerly seen them fall! How have I delighted as I walked to see them driven in showers about me by the wind! What feelings have they, the season, the air, altogether inspired! Now there is no one to regard them. They are seen only as a nuisance, swept hastily off, and driven as much as possible from the sight." "It is not every one," said Eleanor, "who has your passion for dead leaves. No, my feelings are not often shared, not often understood, but sometimes they are. As she said this, she sank into a reverie for a few moments, but rousing herself again, "Now, Edward," said she, calling his attention to the prospect, "here is Barton Valley. Look up it and be tranquil if you can. Look at those hills. Did you ever see their equals? To the left is Barton Park, amongst these woods and plantations. You may see one end of the house, and there, beneath that farthest hill which rises with such grandeur, is our cottage." "It is a beautiful country," he replied. "These bottoms must be dirty in winter." "How can you think of dirt, such objects before you?" "Because," replied he, smiling, "among the rest of the objects before me, I see a very dirty lane." "How strange," said Marianne to herself as she walked on. "Have you an agreeable neighborhood here? Are the Middletons pleasant people?" "Not, no, not at all," answered Marianne. "We could not be more unfortunately situated." "Marianne!" cried her sister, "how can you say so? How can you be so unjust? They are a very respectable family, Mr. Ferrars, and toward us have behaved in the friendliest manner." "Foreign ass hail," thanks Sebian, "and toward us have behaved in the most friendliest manner." They are talking about dirt. Seriously. Don't you want to play some Fortnite? It's true. Actually, good point. I'm going to play Fortnite right now. Have you forgotten, Marianne, how many pleasant days we have owed to them? "No," said Marianne in a low voice, "nor how many painful moments." Eleanor took no notice of this, and directing her attention to their visitor, endeavored to support something like discourse with him by talking of their present residence, its conveniences, etc., extorting from him occasional questions and remarks. His coldness and reserve mortified her severely. She was vexed and half angry, but resolving to regulate her behavior to him by the past rather than the present, she avoided every appearance of resentment or displeasure, and treated him as she thought he ought to be treated from the family connection. Yeah, I'll admit that last chapter was kind of a kind of a dud, kind of mid. Not gonna lie. Uh, Mostly because I just don't really care about what I mean. Like, I don't care about Ferris. I kind of really don't even care about Eleanor. The only character who I'm even remotely okay, that's not true. I like Colonel Brandon. I want to see him get happy, but I also want to see what happens to Marianne. Those are the two characters I care about. I don't. The rest of them, honestly, can go to hell, as they say. I don't really care. "Oh, you want to play some Fortnite or something?" says Sabian. "No, I don't think I want to do that." There's about 25 million Fortnite streamers on YouTube and Twitch. I don't really have any interest in joining those ranks. There's enough of that kind of stuff, as they say. I mean, I actually kind of do want to play some Fortnite right now, but not on stream. You guys don't get to watch. Just because if I did that, then you'd all see how much how terrible I am at Fortnite. That would be that'd be too embarrassing to stand. Thumbs up, says Doctor DeAngles. Irrelevant. Doesn't make any sense. Nothing. No idea what you're responding to. It was too mean. I'm sorry. Well, yeah, that's I don't know why I slipped into this voice. I stole it. Slipped into this voice. That's my new just my new crutch. When I don't have anything else to say, I just say well in something in that voice. My crutch. There's 331 pages. Be nice. Yeah, sorry, Doctor DeAngles. You didn't deserve it. What's the book about? It's about three sisters who are all meeting guys and shacking up and getting married. Really, psych. I don't care. Oh, oh, I've been tricked. Oh, oh, oh man, that really that put us that almost made me throw up. Oh my goodness, disgusting. Oh, jeez. How are you gonna sleep after that, huh? I'm not gonna sleep. I'm gonna stay up all night. My eyes are gonna. I'm gonna be just tossing and turning. I won't be able to sleep. I'll be tormented. Oh man, that just put me in a sour mood. Thanks for ruining my whole night, Sapien. Sapien. Ugh. Oh boy, oh mio mio. well, well. uh, I guess that's the end of the stream. I'm not reading anymore. Are you tired? I am getting tired, and I'm getting tired, and it's kind of messing with my reading. It's making it harder to get the words out right. So I don't want to mess up the words too much. So I am going to call it here, even though the next chapter is only 3 pages. Could easily be done in just a few minutes. Uh, yeah, Ferris is back. Thank you. Thank you for being done, says Dr. DeAngles. That's how little respect I get. I'm thanked when it's over. I guess that's not little respect. Whatever. I say stupid stuff. Thank you for reading. You're welcome. What I do. I'll be doing it to myself, literally just sitting alone doing it. Okay, bye. Bye, Sibian. I hate you so much. You're the best, Dr. Dangles. You're the best, Dr. DeAngles. Not you, Sibian, though. Goodbye, everybody.